Hello everybody, welcome back to the Historian's Craft. So, in this video, I want to talk about one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. So, in Book 1 of the Histories, Herodotus devotes considerable time to the rise of the Achaemenid Empire, and in doing so, he starts off by talking about the revolt of a people called the Medes, an Indo-Iranian people that are related to the Persians, against the Assyrian Empire, which had controlled much of the Near East for about 5 centuries up to that point. And he then tells us that they had 4 kings who ruled for 150 years over this empire, and then, in about 550 BC, the Medians were defeated by Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great, and in so doing, he established the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So what we have here then is one empire, the Median, defeated and conquered by another rising empire, the Achaemenid Persians. And yet, in the Blackwell History of the Ancient Near East, Mark van de Mieroop remarks that this was a fiction and that the Median Empire did not, in fact, ever exist, saying that, quote, according to Herodotus, the Median Empire was overthrown by one of its vassals, the Persian Cyrus. And while elements of Herodotus' story agree with the bits of information we have on the Medes from Assyrian and Babylonian accounts, the whole is a fictitious account. No Median Empire ever existed. So what's going on here? Did one of history's great ancient empires just not exist? If it didn't, then how are we to understand what Herodotus tells us? Why would you make up an entire empire? Especially one that would have comprised over 1 million square kilometers at its height, and is often understood to be a precursor to ancient Persia. How could something like that just disappear or be made up out of whole cloth? Herodotus is sometimes called the father of lies, and he's called the father of lies with great justification, but it would seem that there would have to be a difference between not confirming or making up stories of, like, griffins or some other monster living in Kazakhstan or somewhere else in Central Asia that Herodotus could not go to, and lying about a giant state that would have existed in essentially his own backyard. So what are we to make of this? Well, this is actually a very real ongoing problem in the study of the ancient and classical Near East, so much so that in 2002, a body of work was published titled Medes and Persians, Reflections on Elusive Empires, and the introduction to that volume contains the following sentence. The continuing heated debate about the type of power Media represented, its geographical range, and its qualification for the term empire, become a key issue in Duesenberg's discussion, referring to a later chapter in this volume written by Elspeth Duesenberg, a scholar at the University of Colorado Boulder, which essentially tries to grapple with the problem of Median art and Median archaeology, if it even exists as its own thing, and that's a topic we're going to come back to later in this video. So, the Median state has its own Wikipedia page, and if you click on that page, you'll be brought to this nice looking map, and it has these nice borders, and it's sort of able to overlap with the Achaemenid Empire that came after it. The problem, though, is that we have almost no evidence for anything resembling a Median state, much less an empire, so with that said, let's dive right into this. The first thing we need to come to grips with here is the textual evidence, or rather the general lack of textual evidence. And this is where we come back to Herodotus. So his writing is a key source for both the Medes and the Persians, as well as much else in the Near East, and it's important for one overarching reason above and beyond anything else, really. And that is that the Histories is a big book. The Penguin edition, which is one of the more generally available versions of it, is about 800 pages. Now, granted, that does include an introduction and an index, but it's still about 800 pages. That's pretty long. And it's due to that length that we have a narrative of Median and Achaemenid history up until the time of the Persian Wars in about the 480s BC. Now, Herodotus was writing for an Athenian audience, and thus he tends to have a Greek viewpoint, but overall, what we have here is a fairly lengthy history. For a very, very long time, if you wanted to study Persia, Greek and Roman sources were what you used. But in the 1980s, this began to change because there were a series of academic workshops and conferences which gathered scholars who studied the history of Persia, and it really began to emphasize the fact that, besides the Greek and Roman stuff, there were other sources to utilize. There were Egyptian, Assyrian, Persian, and Indian sources that could be studied. You did not just have to rely on the classical accounts. And the result of this is what's known as the Iranological Revolution, and it's totally transformed the field of Iranian studies, and arguably, it established Achaemenid history as a field in its own right, leading, eventually, to the writing of the first real unifying work on the subject, From Cyrus to Alexander, A History of the Persian Empire, written in 1996. And employing those other sources has essentially thrown the notion of a Median empire out the window. Essentially, thus far, and it could just be the luck of the archaeological draw, or maybe the lack of luck would be a better way of phrasing it, the Medes and then the Persians have left us extremely, and I do mean extremely, little evidence to really work with. We don't have any sort of a narrative history comparable to what Herodotus leaves us, stemming from either native Median or Achaemenid sources or from others nearby, like the Assyrians or the Babylonians. We do have inscriptions and things of that nature, but those are obviously short, and usually they're pretty fragmentary, and they often contradict Herodotus. So another way of putting that, and here I'm really just paraphrasing one of the sources for this video, if you were to take a history of, let's say, the 100 Years' War, written in the 1800s at some point, and you were to compare it to one written in the 2000s, much of the detail and the conclusions would be different, but the people would still exist. Edward III, the Black Prince, Henry V, Joan of Arc, the factions are still there, the war still extends into a succession crisis in Castile, and the famous battles like Agincourt still happen. But if you were to compare a history of Babylon, written in the 1800s, to the 2000s, they basically contrast way more than they compare. Dates and figures are totally moved around, or they're removed entirely because they don't actually exist. And the recovery and employment of sources beyond the classics and the Bible has totally blown holes in what we thought we knew about the ancient Near East and the classical Near East. The exception to this, really, is media. We have not had any sort of Median archive located by archaeologists, so we're still largely dependent on Herodotus for a big-picture approach to the history, and the problem arises when you compare the material archaeological record of what media should be and where it should be to the textual record, both Greek and non-Greek, so Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian, and we have almost nothing in those textual sources and almost nothing in that archaeology, and it gives no indication, contrary to Herodotus, of some sort of mighty, powerful state existing in the region when Herodotus said it should have, and when Assyrian and Babylonian sources can confirm that. So why would Herodotus make up an empire? The answer, essentially, is that while he does record information about Assyria and about Persia, Herodotus and others who came after him did not have direct knowledge of those states. That sort of thing wasn't really discovered until the 19th century. He knew that the Medes did play some sort of a role in destroying the Assyrian Empire around 612 BC, and he knew that the Persians defeated the Medes and absorbed them in about 550 BC, so in the intervening 60 or 70-ish years or so, the Medes must have been politically dominant. So why did Greek historians like Herodotus and others who came after him think this? Well, it's because in terms of chronology, empires seem to be a universal feature, and they still seem to be that way. You can review recorded history as a succession of states which rise and fall, so naturally, in between Assyria and Persia, there must have been a Median empire in his thinking. So this idea of a Median empire appears to have been invented because it filled a gap in ancient historical knowledge, and scholars of the Near East began to really advance this idea starting in the 1980s, essentially that it wasn't real. Nevertheless, although there was not a Median empire as such, and history essentially lied about that until the 19th century, there was a Median civilization. So what does the evidence that we do have that started to be found in the 19th century actually tell us about it? So, in terms of texts that are not Herodotus, and broadly not Greek or Roman, our major sources for this period are Assyrian, specifically Assyrian royal inscriptions that generally date between about 850 BC and about 670 BC, and sometime towards the end of the second millennium BC, groups of Median speakers began to enter and then settle in what is broadly today modern Western Iran. And then, during the 9th and the 8th centuries BC, we have indications that the presence of the Medes was increasing. Northwestern Iran increasingly became one of the raiding grounds for the Assyrian Empire, and this evidently impacted numerous small political units, including the Medes. So with that in mind, the first mention of them is in an Assyrian record, a text dating to 843 BC, during the reign of Shalmaneser III, who ruled between 858 and 824, when he raided the region of Namri. So to get out of Namri and back to Assyria, his army had to pass through the plain of Hamadan, where the Medes were located. They next come into the record a little while later when the great rival to Assyria, Urartu, attempted to invade western Iran, and they were blocked by the Assyrians around the region of Lake Urmia. And then, in 815 BC, Samsi-Adad V, king of Assyria, launched a campaign eastward from Lake Urmia into what Assyrian texts tell us were the Median heartlands. These heartlands were really not that extensive. It's essentially the Hamadan Plain. And although Samsi-Adad V does conquer the region, or at least a part of it, and he apparently attacks what is either suggested to be a major Median city or the major Median city, and he burned over 1,000 towns and imposed tribute, it really doesn't appear from the Assyrian records that they were able to really hold this territory or impose any sort of overlordship in any meaningful sense. Following that, there were 6 campaigns undertaken by Samsi-Adad V's successor, Adad-Nirari, in 809, 800, 799, 793, 792, and 788, but these 6 campaigns were not conclusive militarily. We do know that the Assyrians were destroyed by the Medes and by the Babylonians, and it sort of looks like the seeds for this were sown in about the 740s BC. Once again, it's not clear because the textual evidence we have is really just not overflowing. But we do know that in 745, Tiglath-Pileser III comes to power in Assyria, and he starts reorganizing the Assyrian Empire, especially in conquered areas, and he does this by establishing actual provinces in these conquered regions, complete with tax structures and governors, and by doing this, 3 provinces are created in eastern Assyria. And essentially what happens is the formal borders of Assyria now press up pretty closely against Median territory. Now he does invade Media, apparently he invades all of it, but once again he doesn't seem to be able to fully conquer the region. His successor, Sargon II, though, does appear to have been able to do this, and although he fails in really holding all of Media, the texts tell us that he successfully conquered and held a portion of the region. So what you have happening in the 8th century BC is continuing Assyrian attacks into the Hamadan Plain and either reducing the Median tribes to tributary status, or fostering increasing resistance to the Assyrians, but either way, in order to pay that tribute or to resist the Assyrians militarily, Median political complexity begins to increase. But what does that complexity look like? Given the paucity of evidence, are we able to tell? Well, sort of. The first thing to do in order to really understand what's happening is to get rid of Herodotus' idea of a dynasty of 4 Median kings. Only the last 2 of these 4, Cyaxares and Astyages, who according to Herodotus ruled between 625 BC and 585 BC, and 585 BC and 550 BC respectively, are actually attested in the Assyrian record. The first 2 kings are not, despite efforts to find them in similar names, or in figures with different names who could be the same people listed in the Assyrian texts, but generally, they don't seem to have existed. Instead, the Medes are very much described as disunited pastoral tribes, and although they do have cities and towns which the Assyrians attack, it's not a clearly defined political unit under one family exerting something resembling hegemony. The Babylonian sources we have for about 615 BC to about 550 BC do confirm what Herodotus tells us in that Cyaxares sacks and then basically destroys the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, and that the Medians under Astyages were defeated in 550 BC by Cyrus. But that's about it. There is no indication that the Medians had this massive empire as recorded in Herodotus, and there's not even any indication that they're this major, amazing player. it tends to read more like they have a tough job of attacking and destroying Assyria, while the Babylonians then sweep in and they claim the mantle of Mesopotamian kingship. So then what we're able to understand about Median history from these really sparse sources is basically broken up into three phases. The first phase runs from about 750 BC to about 670 BC, the second phase between about 670 BC and about 610 BC, and the third and final phase runs between 610 BC and 550 BC. This is where we come back to the archaeology and to the art history, because in the absence of good textual sources, obviously you would want to draw more on the material record, but here we run into a problem. It's not that we don't have archaeology for the period when the Median Empire should have existed, between about 612 BC-ish and 550 BC, or maybe pushing it back a little more to something like 650 BC or 700 BC. It's not that there's this massive void in the material record for that period. It's that we do have material evidence, but it's not Median, or at least scholars don't think it's Median. So in the first phase, the Assyrian texts tell us that the Medes were disunited semi-pastoralists who did not have any sort of overarching political hegemony, and this is reflected in the archaeology of the Hamadan Plain. There are towns and what look like estates that have fortifications, walls, that sort of thing, and there are religious buildings like fire temples, as well as storerooms, and the estates appear to have been fairly wealthy. So how do you develop wealth in this area that doesn't appear to be densely populated in this period, and which doesn't appear to have many natural resources? The answer, we think, is that the Medes were breeding a lot of horses and lots of, mobile food, sheep, goats, that sort of thing. It shows up in the material record, and a major trade route, the Khorasan Road, cut through the area. So it's probably the wealth generated from this trade that explains the fortified estates, because at the time the region is otherwise economically fairly simple. There is also a difference in groups that the Assyrians refer to as Medes and remote Medes, and essentially what we think that means is that some groups lived closer to the borders of Assyria, and others lived farther inland on the plains, and the groups closer appear to have been more advanced politically, probably as a result of interaction with Assyria. So towards the end of the 8th century BC, the Assyrian king Sargon II attempted to establish greater control over border regions in Media that were, in theory at least, under the overlordship of Assyria, by establishing Assyrian patterned cities in the area and appointing Assyrian governors. The problem, though, is that this control was never total, and although they existed and governed alongside Median chieftains and pastoralists. Now, after Sargon II dies, Esarhaddon takes over as king of Assyria, and we move into the second phase of Median history, and this is where the vexing problem of archaeology comes into play, and it's why historians have turned against the notion of a Median empire. So, this king, in the 670s, basically pulls out of Media, and he establishes treaties with the Medians instead, establishing trading rights and taking Medians on as royal bodyguards in the Assyrian palace. The sources still list kings and chiefs, that is, plural, but after 672 the treaties shift to the singular, so that must indicate that some sort of unification happened in Media. Well, not exactly. The first problem is that the city that is stated to be the capital of the Medians once they become politically united is Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, and because this city is still inhabited, excavations there have been extremely difficult to do. Now, since the 90s, pieces of land within the city have been purchased and they have been excavated, and the digging informs us that beneath the modern layer is a huge system of fortifications, walls, towers, gates, the works. But it's probably Sasanian, not Achaemenid, and definitely not Median. There are other sites, notably Nushirvan, which can serve as a stand-in for all the rest in demonstrating why Median archaeology is an issue. We have Assyrian texts that mention a town, located approximately 50 kilometers south of Ecbatana, which was definitely Median, according to Assyrian texts. Now this town has been found. The site is known as Nushirvan, and the location, combined with the stratigraphic layers and its mention in Assyrian texts, place it essentially as Median. But the problem is that in doing that digging, although the location and the layers are correct, the artifacts don't appear to be Median. In fact, they appear to be either Achaemenid, which is later, or they appear to be Assyrian, which is earlier. So this then brings us to a dual issue. On the one hand, we don't have a solid archaeological example of what Median material culture actually looks like, and on the other hand, we do have artifacts that are labeled as Median or as Median art, but this is done so because this stuff is sold on the black antiquities market, and it's known that labeling something as Median gives it greater value. So, does that mean that the artifacts recovered from the black market are actually Median? There are not clear answers for this. And in terms of material culture, the Medians appear to be elusive still. We don't know what this looked like, if it looked like anything at all. Furthermore, the size and the complexity of these sites don't make any sense. Mario Liverani, an Italian historian specializing in this period, sums this problem up as follows. The basic result of such archaeological activity for the period which is relevant here, namely the second quarter of the first millennium BC, is that the Median sites underwent a notable burgeoning during the late 8th and the 7th centuries, but were dismissed during the first half of the 6th century. That is exactly when the assumed Median Empire should have reached the peak of its development. The evidence from Nusi-Jan, excavated by David Stronach and Michael Rolfe, is the most clear. The phase Nusi-Jan I is dated to the period circa 750 to 600 BC. The excavators were able to articulate a sequence of the various buildings. The central building, an imposing fire temple, was built at the beginning of the phase, well inside the 8th century, while the fort and the western building with its columned hall were added during the 7th century. These public buildings were subsequently abandoned, and in the first half of the 6th century, the mound was occupied by squatters. In advancing an explanation for the abandonment, the excavators underscored that the archaeological evidence is not in agreement with what is expected from the historical sources, of course, the classical sources. In their first report, they write that both the collapse of Assyria and the gradual erosion of Scythian power may have led to the desertion of a number of strongholds, at least where these lay near the heart of Media's extensive territory. And in their second report, they write that the various buildings appear to have been abandoned in different ways during the period when Median power was still in the ascendant. They did notice, however, that the archaeological data, so badly fitting the classical sources, are, on the contrary, in perfect agreement with the ancient Mesopotamian sources. So this is the weird thing when it comes to Media. The archaeology of sites dating to what should be the Median layer show expansion in the 8th and 7th centuries when Assyrian and Babylonian sources tell us that the Medes were not politically united, and then they seem to show abandonment or shrinkage during what should be the heyday of the Median Empire, when Herodotus tells us that they definitely had a king, Cyaxares, who is confirmed in Assyrian and Babylonian sources. So how do we understand this? Well, there are two possibilities. The first is that Cyaxares was indeed the king of some kind of a unified state, but that's not clear. The second possibility, which is far more likely given what the archaeology looks like, is that there was no Median state as such, and that Cyaxares was chosen to lead all of the Median political units against Assyria for a brief period of time, resulting in the destruction of that empire with the help of the Babylonians. Which then brings us to the third phase of Median history. For about 4 or 5 decades, approximately 610 BC to approximately 570 or 560 BC, the textual record of the Medians basically disappears. It's gone. It's a veritable dark age when it comes to looking for these people in the texts. The Medes then crop back up again in 2 major sources. The first are Babylonian records which discuss the conquest of the Medes by Cyrus II and his defeat of the Median king Astyages, and the second is the Book of Jeremiah, which talks about the kings of Media, once again plural, not singular. The Babylonian sources essentially do the same thing. They talk about multiple kings, then one king, then multiple kings again, and then later, when the last sole ruler is mentioned, in his defeat by Cyrus II, the Median army is recorded as partially deserting. And this all suggests that although Median groups may have grown in political complexity, probably what was happening was that these were still disunited people led by individual kings or chiefs who came together in serious situations, like for the destruction of Assyria or for the fight against Persia. If you remove Herodotus, if you get rid of that narrative, then there's not much that suggests any sort of a unified empire, much less any sort of coherent state. At one point, though, it was thought, indeed it was basically assumed, that the Median Empire was defeated and was taken over by the Persians, who thus inherited all of the territory and who then expanded that territory. This idea comes to us once again from Herodotus and from other classical sources. But if you remove the classical sources, a very, very different picture emerges, one that has been taken up and emphasized by modern scholars of the period, and that is that the basis of the Achaemenid Empire, if that's how we want to think of this, was not Median at all. Instead, it was Elamite, a native culture in Iran. There has been an ongoing search since the 1800s for the Median language and for any sort of Median writing, and thus far nothing has been found. Now, at one point, it was thought that the third script on one of the famous Persian monuments was Median, but it turns out that it is, in fact, Elamite. The Elamite tradition, not the Median tradition if it even had one, formed the core of the Achaemenid Empire, both politically and diplomatically, and in terms of its governmental structures. So, how then do we explain this? Why has there been such a great emphasis in the classical sources, and then through them, in much of history, on media as the basis of Persia, when it appears to be wrong when you take the other sources into account? The answer is that the Greeks and then the Romans did not know about the Elamites, and they did not know about these other sources. Modern people didn't know about them until the 19th century. What they did know about, however, were the Medians. And to fill the gap in the chronology of succeeding empires, a fictional one, the Medians, seemed to fit the bill.